Hello and welcome back to the Software Architecture vlog series, where we speak about all things software architecture. I'm your host Tengiz. I'm a software architect with experience in application, solution and enterprise architecture fields. I'm also a book author. My book is about engineering excellence, software architecture and leadership best practices within enterprises. Today I will speak about services, and services again. I will distinguish two primary kinds of services, which is data services and business services. And I will also briefly touch a topic of microservices and see where it fits in the overall picture. And the question of the day would be whether we are doing this right or not. Let me first try to distill the questions that I mentioned. In today's world, we are building and consuming a lot of services, and this has changed since I started my career about 2 decades ago, when I was not consuming any services and I was not even building these services. I was primarily focused on building desktop client applications or little websites, and that was it. But nowadays we consume a lot of services and we build them as well, so it is important to understand how to do this right and when to apply such patterns as scaling and the caching or CQRS or message broker or load balancer or even EDA, which stands for event-driven architecture. If these are the questions that puzzle you as well, it is time to answer them now. Throughout my career, as I kept building services, I noticed that two primary patterns emerged. First was the data service and the second was a business service. I distinguish them so that the data service is primarily responsible for storing the data, while a business service has some side effects. In other words, it has a business logic within it encapsulated besides just storing the data. Perhaps you are using both business and data services in your work, but you don't distinguish them clearly between each other. If you start to do this now, you can as well build them much better in the future, because various patterns that I mentioned earlier apply differently to these two groups of services. I will get to those patterns a little bit later in this conversation, but right now I want you to focus on the primary difference between the business service and the data service, and that is how you build and consume them. You build a data service in a simple, straightforward fashion, because all you do is consume the data, store it, and give it back when they ask you to do so, as well as modify it when they command to do so. So building part is very easy. As about consuming the data service, it is not as straightforward, because the consumer needs to house that business logic, which is not in the data service. Now look at the business service. With the business service, you encapsulate all kinds of business logic and solutions to the technical problems such as scalability within the business service. That makes the consuming part very easy, because the consumer can rely on the business service that it solves all problems and encapsulates those solutions within, and from the consuming side they just invoke the service, and that is it. Now it is about time to discuss those patterns that I mentioned earlier, and at the same time with this topic I will be clarifying why it is important to distinguish between the two service types from both building as well as the consuming standpoint. So at a bare minimum, a data service is something that you just use as is. You don't expect any side effects besides those that you explicitly asked it to make. That means it is very easy to guess the result of the operation, so you can scale that construct very easily. For instance, when user submits a request to your web application and you know that all you have to do is store the data, you could tell the user that you already did it and store it later. That would significantly improve the performance of your application if you wanted to do so. On the other hand, with a business service, you cannot really do the same trick, because there are some side effects which are encapsulated within a business service, and you cannot really say whether they will succeed or not from the outside. So all you can do for scaling the process would be to tell the users that their request is accepted and would be processed later. That was from a consumer standpoint. And how about when you build the business service? Of course, you need to take the same approach and don't rely on the consumer knowing your internal logic. There should be little or no knowledge of your internal implementations to the consumer. That is what distinguishes business service from the data service, which actually goes on the other extreme of this equation. How about caching? The same solution applies here as well. With the data service, you know when the data becomes stale because you send the modification request to the data service yourself as a consumer. And when you build this service, it is straightforward. You don't have to even worry about the cache because the storage is the cache. And the business service consumer cannot assume anything about caching. That is exactly why it is important to encapsulate even caching within the business service. Several times I have seen consumers who try to cache the data which they receive from the business service, and then they engage in conversations with the business service developers to understand how often the data changes, but that becomes a catch-up game, and I don't recommend that you get into that situation. And to not repeat myself too much, the same solution applies to the CQRS as well. For the data service, it must be outside, and from the business service, it must be inside. The only difference would be that when you apply CQRS within a business service, that means that you will have endpoints which allow consuming stale data, and you have the endpoints which process the data in a delayed fashion or something of that sort. As about the EDA or the event-driven architecture, the data service does not even care about this, so you would put the event-driven consumers and publishers outside of the data service, and you would pass that data to the data service when ready. As about the business service, event-driven architecture is more relevant to it because you are dealing with both the integration events as well as the domain events with the business service, while data service does not really care about them. And the two patterns might apply to both the data service and the business service, and that is a message broker and the load balancer. If you are building a data service, you might decide to build a load balancer inside if you have multiple nodes and if you want to encapsulate that distribution problem from the outside world, and you might as well put a message broker to distribute the data toward various nodes of your data storage. And that is a similar approach to what you would do with the business service as well. So those two patterns are quite interesting, but perhaps outside of the scope for this conversation to get into more details. And going back to the question of the day, are we doing it right? Well, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, I have discovered that developers and architects don't consider the differences between the services, and they end up building a lot of business services, even though some of them start from being a data service originally, but become a business service because they add side effects to them as well. And that is something that I don't recommend doing. If you started building a data service, it makes most sense to keep it as data service, because then the consumers will always assume that there are no side effects in the data service besides those comments that they send to you themselves. And with the business service, I have seen other anti-patterns, and that is the developers of the business service a lot of times do not realize that it is necessary to integrate all the solutions within a business service, so they put that responsibility on the consuming side. What that means is that consuming those business services is not so easy, and it just unnecessarily complicates the entire solution. For instance, on the consumer side, if you have to think about caching the business service responses, you will have to understand how often the data changes on the business service side, and you will have to create some kind of tight coupling between your consumer logic and the business service logic. And if we could solve these anti-patterns, perhaps we could drastically improve the quality of the solution architectures that we deliver. I could not end this topic without touching this important subject, about microservices. What are those and where do they fit in these two patterns that I mentioned earlier? Well, the microservices are business services, and indeed, if you think about this, we apply the same patterns and solutions to the microservices that I described earlier as a business service. First, the microservice has some side effects typically, and it has some business logic within. It makes it a business service. But the anti-patterns repeat here as well if we are not very careful. We should make the microservice as self-contained as possible so that from the outside it is easy to consume them. And actually, when you go and read the microservice definition, it is exactly that. It must be easy to consume, and all the caching or the scaling must be implemented inside the microservice. Interestingly, because this term is new and because it has multiple interpretations, some data services that exist today would also qualify as microservices, because this term today refers to the service that is deployable in isolation, scalable in isolation, and encapsulates its own problems within. So in a way, you can think about the topics that we discussed earlier as just a drill down into the microservices and distinguishing two kinds of services that you are building. That was it for today. I hope that I was able to help you distinguish between different kinds of services, but most importantly between various patterns that you will apply to different situations when building and consuming services. And the most important conclusion that I want you to make out of this subject is that you need to distinguish and keep the line clear between the two kinds of services, because that improves their maintainability as well as overall quality. I hope you enjoyed watching, and if so, please click thumbs up button so that others can also find this resource on YouTube. Subscribe to my channel and you will receive notifications about future episodes that I will put on this channel approximately once a week. You can leave your questions and suggestions in the comment section below. In the description of this video, I will put a couple of useful links to the related blog posts as well as reading material so that you can extend your knowledge around this topic again. And check out my book, which is about engineering excellence, software architecture, and leadership best practices taken from my experience while working with enterprises of Fortune 500 and others. I'm your host Tengiz, and this was Software Architecture blog series. Until next time, bye bye.